issue the now familiar thanks. It's such a great honour and privilege to be here to talk about Chicago Surrealism in the presence of some of its founder members and its friends, and in a room full of people who kind of love and are enthusiastic about it. So this really is a unique opportunity. Thank you so much to Jen, who's not here, for organising it, but thanks and love to everybody. So, historicising surrealism in Chicago. In March 1978, an exhibition opened at the Uzuki Art Center in Cedarburg, Wisconsin, which was dedicated to both surrealism in 1978 and the 100th anniversary of Hysteria. It was put together by the International Surrealist Movement with contributions from the Belgian Fathers Group and organised by Franklin Rosemont, who, along with his wife Penelope, as we know very well, have been at the helm of a group of surrealist artists and activists based in Chicago for over a decade. The exhibition featured an eclectic array of objects, paintings, drawings and collages from participants in 22 different countries as part of this staged eruption of hysteria into the Midwest, which, like the rest of the United States, was in the grip of the worst recession since the Depression, with social and political conservatism in the ascendant. The exhibition culminated the group's efforts over the preceding 12 years to elaborate not only the history but the future of the surrealist movement in America, at a moment when its past was being collated by cultural and academic institutions on the assumption it had expired. This paper explores the representation and mobilization of hysteria in Chicago surrealism, focusing on the way in which it was used to elaborate a historiographical method that challenged the characterization of surrealism as a deceased European modern art movement. So, opening 2 years after the success of the international exhibition Marvelous Freedom, the 100th anniversary of Hysteria, included a wide variety of artworks which engaged with hysteria in formal, thematic and iconographic ways. And excuse the really scruffy PowerPoint, I only have access to the catalogue. It's rather rubbish photocopies, and so I'm afraid you're bearing the brunt of that here. So, for instance, Franklin Rosemont's coloured ink and pencil drawing, The Hysterical Alphabet, featured brightly coloured, though we can't see the colour, biomorphic forms, some of which were tightly packed with capital letters. Along with Deborah Taub's Vowels Move in Strange Ways, which you're also looking at, it seemed to reference the disturbances of language germane to hysterical patients, and intimates an alternative language of bodily exuberance and sensuality. Other works, such as Baghdad-born Abdul Qadir El-Janabi, Dr. Charcot's Laughter, combined collage fragments of hands, machines, and an axe, recalling Max Ernst's collage novels, such as Dream of a Little Girl Who Wanted to Enter the Carmelite Order of 1934, which themselves mobilized hysteria as a way of interrogating patriarchal institutions of church, science, and the family. The catalogue essay by Franklin Rosemont, titled The 100th Anniversary of Hysteria, offered little commentary on the works in the show, and instead elaborated on the group's burgeoning interest in hysteria. It articulated a mode of historiography that indigenized surrealism in the United States, and it is this method which I'm going to focus on today. So I have less to say about the artworks in the show and much more to say about how Franklin Rosemont in particular elaborates what I'm going to call a kind of a hysterical historiography of surrealism. The Chicago Group's 1978 exhibition was presented as a continuation of André Breton and Louis Aragon's text, the 50th anniversary of Hysteria, which I'm sure you all know, published in issue 11 of La Révolution Surréaliste in 1928. This text was reprinted in the 1978 exhibition catalogue and promoted to the status of manifesto in Franklin Rosemont's prefatory statements. Breton and Aragon's text rejected the condition's varied diagnoses since Jean Charcot's attempts to systematise its symptoms in the late 19th century at the legendary Salpêtrière Hospital. Rather than a pathological condition, Breton and Aragon redefined hysteria as, in their words, the greatest poetic discovery of the 19th century, a supreme means of expression. Hysteria became an obsession of the Parisian group, referenced across their art, literature and photography, and lauded for its capacity to confound those who would cure rather than celebrate its promiscuity and state of abandon. Some 50 years later, in the 100th anniversary text, Franklin Rosemont wrote, and these are his words, "The concept of hysteria needs to be restored to its surrealist destiny," adding that the exhibition served, in his words, as a warning and even a call to arms, closing his text rather ominously with the line, "In 1978, the problem of hysteria is not yet settled." Now, The cover and the back page of the catalogue for the 100th anniversary exhibition featured photographs of Augustine, a 15-and-a-half-year-old hysterical patient at the Salpêtrière Hospital from 1875, until her escape in 1880, who had been one of Charcot's favourites. Having suffered from sexual violence from a family member, Augustine was photographed, manipulated, hypnotised, drugged and subject possibly to further sexual abuse at the hospital. The same picture, along with 5 others, have been used to illustrate Breton and Aragon's text of 28, captioned Les Attitudes Passionnelles, making explicit the erotic attraction of the hysteric to the heterosexual masculinist surrealist gaze. Augustine became, according to Georges de Huberman, the star, these are his words, the star model for a whole concept of hysteria. And as Elaine Showalter noted, she functioned as the pin-up girl of the surrealists, but in 1978, she was not alone in this role as mascot for the condition. In the catalogue essay, Rosemont imagines a suggestive convivial scene in which he raises his glass to beautiful Augustine, but he also toasts her American equivalent, declaring everlasting glory to Smokey Stover, the protagonist of the screwball comic strip drawn by Bill Holman, which was published in the Chicago Tribune from 1935 to 1973. Rosemont elaborates on their incongruous pairing in his essay, which maps the history and prehistory of hysteria in the United States, defining it, like Breton and Aragon, as an embattled poetic expression, which was incompatible with the dominant cultural and social orders. He suggests that, and these are his words, qualified defenders of the poetic spirit staged right in the middle of American popular culture nothing less than their own celebration of hysteria. Rosemont and the Chicago group did not so much tell the history of hysteria and surrealism as hystericized surrealist history, by making its repression speak and deciphering its unorthodox modes of expression, which, like the hysteric's profane language of the body, could not find a recognizable voice in the cultural and social mainstream. Instead, the Chicago surrealists elaborated a theory and history of surrealism's fugitive creative expression that traced its symptoms, its convulsions, twitches, silences, and tics, across a cultural landscape that stretched far wider than galleries of 20th century European art and libraries of French literature, which had, they argued, corralled the movement into specious, medium-specific, mono-nationalist definitions. Traces of Rosemont's formulation of a hysterical historiographical method can be found in an earlier essay of his called The Seismograph of Subversion, Notes on some American Precursors, published in the SDS journal Radical America in 1970. And I'm really struck why a seismograph, rather than a calendar, for instance, should be Rosemont's chosen method of historical accounting. A seismograph indexes the movement of the Earth's surface caused by friction between or collisions of tectonic plates, and, like other graphic trace methods, and a longer version of this paper goes on to explore the relationship between surrealism and the graphic trace method, lends visual form to the release of these invisible energies or forces over time. So Rosemont's invocation of the trope of the seismograph to relate surrealism's history casts the movement as a function of natural rather than cultural history, as though it derived from the convulsions of some subterranean unconscious. Emulating Breton's survey of proto-surrealists in the First Manifesto, as well as taking its cue from the forays into American culture published in the Bretonian Group's magazine during its wartime exile VVV, Rosemont's text sought to establish a genealogy of exclusively American precursors to surrealism. It tracks the limited and discontinuous opportunities for the appearance of the poetic during the colonial era and 19th century to the slightly more hospitable climate of the 20th century. And Rosemont isolates moments in America's cultural history at which some kind of poetic marvelous registers on the seismograph, which he casts as veritable hysterical symptoms that index the repressions and silences which constitutes surrealism's past in America. And his revisionist cultural history yields both surprising and unexpected results. So Michael Wigglesworth's Puritan Jeremiah Day of Doom of 1662 is praised for its remarkable poetic potentiality. Perhaps more predictably, Edgar Allan Poe, who's already singled out by Breton in the First Manifesto, is added to this roster of those who have served as a conduit for the marvellous. In the 20th century, popular visual and music culture register most highly on this seismograph of subversion. And comics and cartooning in particular, in his words, comprise one of the century's clearest windows on all that is most marvellous in the imaginative life of man. And the article, as you can see, is lavishly illustrated with undated and untitled frames from George Herriman's cartoon strip Crazy Cat and Winsor Mackay's Little Nemo. Insofar as it registers on a seismograph, the history of surrealism is a function of an underground unconscious whose appetites are less sexual than economic. Rosemont explains, these surrealist voices from the past, which lie repressed beneath the surface of American culture, desire nothing other, and these are his words, than the cause of human emancipation, conceived in its most expansive sense, in which the seizure of power by the proletariat is an absolute essential preliminary. The year after the 100th anniversary of Hysteria exhibition, the Chicago group published their landmark Surrealism and its Popular Accomplices, a special issue of Cultural Correspondence, in 1979. In this treasure trove of surrealist research into popular culture, Franklin Rosemont references hysteria explicitly in his lengthy and detailed text about comics. He describes the word-image relations in comics as a new kind of hieroglyphic poetry, or hysterical hieroglyphics. Rosemont details evidence of what he terms the hysterical hieroglyph in Holman's Smoky Stover. Set in a fire station, the strip depicts the activities of the hapless Smoky Stover, his chief and colleagues, and their usually unsuccessful efforts at firefighting. It was Smoky Stover with whom Rosemont had paired Augustine in the 100th anniversary of Hysteria exhibition catalogue the previous year, declaring him to be one of those, in his words, many others who have defined in their own precious moments, many others who have defined in their own way precious moments in hysteria's ever radiant becoming. The strip's most distinctive feature is the ubiquity of visual and verbal puns and the destabilization of depicted space. In one of the frames illustrating Rosemont's text, two pictures hang on the wall behind the central figure, one slightly behind the other. The top picture appears as though it could be a portrait or a window, insofar as it contains a man who, rather than staring out at the viewer, is drinking through a long straw a glass of iced tea featured in the picture below, depicted as a glass with a capital T in it. So Smoky Stover is a highly reflexive and recursive comic strip, and as Rosemont suggests, figures in portraits lead adventures of their own, challenging distinctions between real characters and their material surroundings. Nothing is inert in the strip. It seems to contain a multitude of different realities in which the limits of possibility are never defined. The viewer must confront the conventions of the depiction of three-dimensional space and is invited to see through them to other dimensions intimated within or beyond. Hysteria is figured in Smoky Stover through the abundance of visual and verbal puns, which undermines the autonomy of either mode of signification and insists on their mutual penetration and corruption. Insisting on the materiality of words and letters and the intelligibility of the pictorial image through verbal language, the script requires a new kind of visual verbal language, or visual verbal literacy, to decipher the hysterical disruption of conventional semiotic relations. Now, if the politics of class are clearly elaborated in Rosemont's account of hysteria, he is perhaps less forthcoming about the politics of gender. Feminist critiques of European surrealism's recourse to hysteria are trenchant and well-rehearsed. So in Susan Rubin Suleiman's memorable formulation, the surrealist seized upon and promoted Charcot's legacy of, in her words, the mad woman observed, theatricalized, photographed, eroticized, seemingly more interested in the sexual or poetic appeal of hysteria than the traumatic experiences of the hysterical women themselves. And I don't especially want to weigh in here, but I do think that some intellectual and cultural history might be helpful. When the Chicago group turned to hysteria in the 1970s, its currency had changed radically since Breton and Aragon celebrated its 50th anniversary in 1928. And one feature of its new identity was the potential for a profoundly different relationship with and politicization of the feminine. At mid-century, and these are really broad brushstrokes, but at mid-century within the École Freudienne, Jean-Jacques Lacan revived interest in the condition as part of his return to Freudian psychoanalysis. And within this ferment in French intellectual life, the influential feminist intervention into the historiography of hysteria began to be articulated and codified. So Hélène Cixous and Catherine Clément's The Newly Born Women of 1975, as well as Cixous' The Laugh of the Medusa, posited the illegibility of the feminine within phallocentric symbolic orders, and described the discourse of the hysteric as an embodied counter-language which both enacted and protested women's marginalisation from the cultural mainstream. Similarly, the Anglo-American feminist tradition also turned to hysteria in the 1970s and 80s, despite its long-standing suspicion of psychoanalysis as antithetical to a feminist politics. At the vanguard, literary theorists and historians explored the frequency of hysterical women, or more formally speaking, a hysterical mode of writing, in the works of 19th and early 20th century fiction. Classic texts of feminist literary history, such as Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gruber's The Mad Woman in the Attic of 1979, define madness as the consequence of and proto-protest against the absence of self-determination and expression available to women who were expected to conform to rigid models of femininity. This project to hystericize literature sought to develop a hermeneutic that could uncover a radical alterity within writing by or about women, which could not be articulated on the text surface, but was instead revealed in its interstices, gaps and repressions. And broadly speaking, this is how I'm suggesting Rosemont is mobilising hysteria, so in a slightly different way to how Breton and Aragon were 50 years earlier. So how does this different currency for hysteria in 1978 compared with 1928 affect our interpretation of the exhibition's recourse to the condition? Does Chicago Surrealism eroticize, romanticize, or exoticize the hysterical woman, as Suleiman charged the Parisian group? Penelope Rosemont and Nancy Joyce Peters in particular have challenged the reading of Surrealism as catering for the interests and appetites of men only, and their research, writing, and editorial labour over the last few decades has aimed to radically rethink Surrealism's gender politics. Penelope Rosemont's collection Surrealist Women, an international anthology of 98, gathered together material from women surrealists across the 20th century. The anthology demonstrated the long-standing importance of women in the movement beyond their conventionally acknowledged roles as wives, lovers, and muses. In her research, both in the anthology and beyond, woman is not the other to modernity. Rather, women were at the vanguard of challenges to pro-natalist and Vichy France, colonial Martinique, the military-industrial complex in the United States, Catholic Italy, post-revolutionary Iran, to cite a few locations in which she has argued that surrealist production is both necessary and useful. Women mounted their own visible challenges to these varied experiences of modernity rather than being ventriloquized by or acting as the cipher, trope, or figure for them in masculinist production. So there was, Penelope and Peters suggest, no monolithic masculinist surrealist voice. It was always riven with those of actual women. And for this reason, the question of an illegitimate appropriation of a feminized position as the condition for their challenge to modernity is problematic because women artists themselves were actively contributing to this challenge. And save for the representation of Augustine in the exhibition catalogue, Chicago Surrealism seldom mobilizes the eroticized specular iconography of feminized hysteria. Hysteria looks and functions in a manner that is more akin to some feminist remodelings of the condition, insofar as it indicates a certain semiotic disruption, as we have seen in the analysis of Smoky Stover, and the method of interpretation required to trace these distortions back to their source, namely the search for evidence of dominant culture's repressions, which register as shocks or contortions on its surface. In Franklin Rosemont's formulations, hysteria indexes a form of cultural rather than sexual trauma, and is invoked as a way of modelling the cultural ordeal experienced by surrealism at the hands of the cultural mainstream, which will only acknowledge its incarnation as a deceased European art form. So the limited range of opportunities for surrealism's self-expression and actualization produce the hysterical symptoms and hieroglyphic distortions which are strewn across discourses and practices such as popular culture, which were more hospitable to bodily, humorous, and affective modes of expression. And I want to conclude by way of thinking about the figure of the clinician or theorist. As Elaine Showalter notes, and these are her words, hysteria needs a doctor or theorist, an authority figure, who can give it a compelling name and narrative, citing Charcot, Freud, and later Lacan as the obvious examples of such hysterical impresarios. We might suggest that Franklin Rosemont performs a similar paternalistic and performative role in his writings about hysteria. His emphasis on interpretation as a form of praxis, that claim in the seismograph of subversion text that, and these are his words, The degree to which these figures of the past speak in this surrealist voice is precisely the degree to which they speak directly to those of us who have rallied to the surrealist cause, finds an analogue in the interpretive operations of the 19th century clinicians. So in Rosemont's formulation, these American precursors only speak in a surrealist voice if they are heard by surrealist ears. Decoding hysterical hieroglyphics becomes a form of encoding. And over 100 years earlier, Charcot noted of his practice of interpreting hysterical symptoms, "I inscribe what I see." And Georges Didier Huberman's extensive study of the iconography of the Salpêtrière argues that Charcot engaged in a complex process of creative transference with his hysterical patients. Both stood to gain from the felicitous performance of a hysterical attack and its treatment. "The hysteric," he writes, "makes herself over in the image of his desire to know." In this chimeric exchange, this moment of reciprocal seduction, as described by Breton and Aragon, who acknowledge the idea that suggestion and counter-suggestion might be in play, it is difficult to apportion agency or causality. This slippage is exploited by Rosemont in his hysterical historiography of surrealism and its relationship to popular culture, insofar as it yields a reversible formulation that strategically abnegates the need to pose the relationship in causal chronological terms, to ask, for instance, whether Holman had ever heard of hysteria or surrealism, because the seductive encounter elides questions of intentionality or responsibility, of origin or copy. There we go.